Welcome to the Impactus podcast. I'm Mauricio Rosa, and today we have a special episode of our Impactus podcast. This episode is from This Is Me TV, our online TV series featuring various Christian artists and athletes sharing their stories of how God is working in their lives. So Dave McSporen, the producer of the This Is Me TV, catches up with Harmony Grillo to see how life has changed for her since our original TV series episode in 2016. So Harmony talks about her life as a stripper in the commercial sex industry and how she was rescued by God's grace and love. She talks about the work she's doing today, helping other women around the world to find freedom, healing, recovery, and hope. It's a powerful message that shines a light on the damage done by the sex industry around the world. So let's go to our This Is Me TV interview with Harmony.
Give us a little teaser of what your life has been.
My mother really struggled with a substance abuse issue. She left me at 13, along with my 8-year-old brother, with $20 and a book of food stamps. And it was at that point that I became involved with an older boy in my neighborhood. And it was that relationship that led me to working in the commercial sex industry.
Welcome to the This Is Me TV podcast, brought to you by Impactus. My name is Dave, and we're excited to be bringing you this podcast on top of the docuseries. And what's interesting for the next few episodes is we're going to be reconnecting with past guests from the docuseries and just sort of hear what's been going on in their lives since the episode, what God's been teaching us all, and probably talk a little bit of what happened behind the scenes. We are grateful to have Harmony Grillo. Last time we connected with her, it was in California. Today we're here to catch up with her and just to hear what's been going on in her life. So thanks for being with us, Harmony.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Good to see you after all these years.
For everyone that hasn't watched the episode, they can go and watch the episode. They can pause this right now and go watch it. But give us a little life summary, a little teaser of what your life has been, because it's pretty crazy.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, I mean, my history is not that uncommon for women who end up working in the commercial sex industry or becoming susceptible to exploitation and trafficking. I have a background of a lot of sexual abuse at the hands of multiple people, both men and women. That up to 90% of women in the sex industry have that same history. I also had other vulnerabilities, including poverty, including being the daughter of someone who my mother really struggled with a substance abuse issue. She had a cocaine addiction. She herself was a survivor of trauma that didn't have tools for recovery and didn't ever really resolve or process the trauma from her past. So she brought a lot of her brokenness into her parenting. One of my abusers was my mother's boyfriend. At that time, I was 13, and I finally started standing up for myself. I ran away from home to get away from the situation. And my mom, ended up asking him to leave and told me I could come home. It was safe, and I did. And then after that, she ended up leaving to follow him to Canada, of all places. And she left me at 13, along with my 8-year-old brother, for 3 months with $20 and a book of food stamps, which are government vouchers for food. And once the $20 and the food stamps ran out, I was stealing to feed my brother and I, and obviously was in a very vulnerable situation, not having any parental supervision, not having money. And it was at that point that I became involved with an older boy in my neighborhood. Now I can look back and I can see that his intention was to exploit me. But at the time, I just saw a knight in shining armor. He's given me food. He's taking care of me. He's protecting us. I was in a very gang-ridden neighborhood. So that relationship, I became very bonded to him in what I now know is a trauma bond, and really came to believe that my survival depended on him. And it was that relationship that led me to working in the commercial sex industry and strip clubs at the age of 19. And essentially my boyfriend became my pimp. That's it in a nutshell.
And there was no way that I was going to try to explain that, because I was thinking about this the other day. I was like, okay, so I'm going to try and say, well, so Harmony's past, she's been left by her mother. She's been sexually abused. I'm like, right here, I'm like, I can't even say no. You need to share this. So it is a traumatic past. It's a very traumatic past. And it's something that not everyone knows, but at the same time, you said there is a lot of people that do experience this. Why is this common amongst people within the sex industry?
Well, what I can say about sexual abuse specifically is those of us that have histories of sexual abuse, a lot of times what we end up experiencing is this profound sense of powerlessness over our own body. In those situations where we're being victimized as children, we don't have the voice or the power to say no or to stop it. And it's this experience of a profound powerlessness. And then the other things that happen is those experiences for many of us, myself included, cause us to develop a sense that our value is in our sexuality. That's what I was receiving attention for. And just really some distorted views around relationships with men for me, I began to experience. So the reason I think all of that is connected to the commercial sex industry is being comfortable with being sexualized and objectified as a job requirement in the commercial sex industry. And in a sense, sexual abuse for many people desensitizes us to the experience of being sexualized and objectified. And then the other thing about it, there's this false sense of empowerment that is one of the lures of the commercial sex industry, especially nowadays with it becoming way more mainstream, way more glamorized in mainstream media. It's selling this idea that you as a woman can take back control of your sexuality. You can harness it for your own profit and financial gain. And now you're empowered, right? And so that, even though there were all these other dynamics that went into me entering the sex industry, financial poverty, exploitation, all of these things, one of those pieces I do believe that was kind of appealing to me was this idea that I could take back control of my sexuality. And now I am not being used and abused. This is my mentality at first, by other people. I'm using and abusing myself and for my own gain. Now, mind you, I was giving all of my money to my pimp, but this is the story that I was telling myself. But it didn't take very long for me to realize that I actually wasn't the one with the power, because the person with the money had the power. And they were the ones that got to call the shots. And it didn't take long for me to realize that I didn't have the power. And eventually I grew to understand that I was being re-victimized in those situations. And in a way, reenacting the trauma from my past, where now I'm powerless again. I'm at the mercy of the person with the dollar. I'm at the mercy of my exploiter, and I have no power. And I'm once again being used for my sexuality. So, everyone's reasons for entering the commercial sex industry is different. Not everyone's story is the same. I'm not here to say 100% of women in the commercial sex industry have histories of sexual abuse, but a large majority do. But what is common is a history of vulnerability. And when you take those vulnerabilities and you take a person with certain sets of vulnerabilities, whether it be having been in foster care, 70% of female trafficking victims in the United States are from the foster care system. And so that's not a coincidence. They have a certain vulnerability that make them more susceptible to exploiters, that make them more susceptible to ending up in these situations. So when you take a person who's vulnerable and you place them in a context of a culture that glamorizes the sex industry, where there's a demand for commercial sex, where people are spending, billions of dollars a year on porn, who knows how much money on escorting, prostitution, strip clubs, and there's a demand for this vulnerable person to sell herself, you can understand how she ends up there. It's an interplay of the vulnerability and the environmental factors. So, but it is different for everyone. But you usually are going to find some kind of vulnerability that's a push factor and some kind of environmental draw that is a pull factor. And we go into depth in this in some of the trainings that we do, but that's it in summary.
Yeah, that's it. That's a lot.
That's a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot, and it's very complex, but at the same time, it's very simple.
Right.
I think when I read your book, Scars and Stilettos, it was so simple. You were looking for love. You were looking for someone. You were looking for a family. You were looking for companionship, and the people in your life that were offered it to you with a clause, with something in it for them.
Right.
It wasn't unconditional.
Right.
And so as you had this exchange, as you talked about in your book, the trauma bond that you guys had, but it just got deeper and more inseparable even as crazy as it got. If you haven't watched or read the book or listened to the book, you should go listen to the book. It's on. I listened to it on Audible, but you can get it off Amazon as well. So yeah, it's incredible. It's one of those things that you can just listen to at any time. So it's complex, but it's simple. But it's painful, and it's so painful to hear it. You know, always being the outsider, you can easily just be like, oh no, you should just do it this way. Being outside of a relationship is so different than being inside of the relationship.
Right. I remember someone said to me when they were trying to help me see that I was in an abusive relationship, which, as you can imagine, didn't work very well. That doesn't usually work very well when you try to do that to someone who's so stuck in it. And I remember her saying to me, Harmony, sometimes it's hard to see the forest when you're standing in the middle of it. You can't see the whole picture, you know? And of course, unfortunately, I cut that friendship off because she was challenging this abusive relationship. And that's what many of us do when we're stuck in these kind of really toxic relationships and situations, is that the voices that are kind of bumping up against it, we're not ready for it. And so I pushed her out. But yeah, it's hard to see it when you're in it, and it's hard to understand when you're standing outside of it. Actually, just yesterday, we released a new little 70-page book called Someone I Love, a guide to helping people stuck in unhealthy behaviors and relationships, because of this exact reason. So many of us, and I have a history of codependency as well, being the daughter of an addict. You know, I came into the work that I do with Treasures wanting to support other women in their healing and their growth and their recovery. And I didn't always do that well, because I was doing things codependently. I was trying to, you know, tell them what they should do, should all over them. You should break up with this guy. You should do this. And if you just did these 5 things, your life would change. And why aren't you listening to me? Like I did it, you know? So obviously that didn't work out very well. And it didn't take long for me to realize that there was a better way. And so that's one of the things I'm really passionate about, is equipping people to really effectively reach, care for, and support the people in their lives that are stuck in unhealthy relationships and behaviors. And, you know, there's a way to do that well, and there's a way to do that not well. And so hopefully with this little guide, we're giving people some tools to do that well.
That sounds incredible. And I love how you call it, I should have all over them, because that's just hilarious. And we do that all the time. We always you know, point out the speck of sawdust in someone else's eye when we've got that plank eye.
Right.
Not saying you got a plank coming out of your eye, Harmony. Not saying that. No.
Right. No, totally. I absolutely did. Well, here's the thing about it, is that for me and my codependency, what I discovered is that as long as I was focused on everyone else's problems, then I never had to face myself. But once I finally started to kind of release that desire to fix and change and quote unquote rescue, which is a whole thing, another thing, don't get me going there. But it's not, when I finally released that desire to fix and change and help everyone else from this codependent, unhealthy place, I was left with my own brokenness and my own self and my own things that I had to face about myself. And, you know, that was hard at first, but I'm much healthier for it. And the people around me, I'm able to actually support them in a way that is helpful, to actually help them in a way that's helpful because of the growth that I went through and the recovery that I went through. So
when we shot the episode together, you had talked about how your boyfriend was your pimp. And so in my mind, I went to Hollywood, I went to cinematic stories, but it wasn't that after I read the book. It was very low key. Can you sort of describe what a pimp basically is today, what it was for you, but what it is and what it's not compared to the Hollywood films?
Right. Because a lot of times what we see depicted in films are what we refer to as like the gorilla pimp. And so that's someone who uses brute force and violence to intimidate and threaten their victims. And we certainly see that. That absolutely does exist. That is happening. But when you're thinking about it from, you know, in terms of what's actually more effective in terms of brainwashing and manipulating vulnerable people, those tactics aren't the most effective. And so what we see more often are what we call Romeo pimps. And these are pimps who use the promise of romance and love and relationship to manipulate. A lot of times, like in my case, there were abusive elements to it. There was definitely emotional abuse. There was physical abuse. But that's not the primary tool of manipulation that he used with me. he used this Romeo pimping tactic. And so when my husband and I go into juvenile detention centers and we work with young girls, many of whom are in there that are in relationships with pimps that are being trafficked and exploited, in their experience, they're in love with these men. They can't wait to get out of juvie to go back and be with them again, because they have been sold this bill of goods and this lie that it's them against the world and they're the only person who loves them and they couldn't make it without them and they couldn't survive without them. And we as victims really begin to believe that. And, there's all these other elements to it, like really with this kind of dynamic, like my identity was wrapped up in his view and perspective of me, but there are certain brainwashing techniques and tactics that they use actually so that they begin to define who you are and your identity. And then on top of it, there's another form of pimping and exploiting that my friend Rachel Thomas, she coined this term, and it's CEO pimps. And essentially, these are people who use the promise of career and success to manipulate victims. And we see this a lot, especially in big metropolitan cities like Los Angeles, Atlanta, New York, Florida, Miami, places where there's an entertainment industry. And a lot of times what they'll say is like, oh, I can get you in, I can get you jobs, I can help you break in, you're going to be famous, you've got what it takes, you're beautiful, you could be a model, I'm a manager, I'm an agent, whatever. And even sometimes in certain situations, we'll get them legitimate work in these industries to kind of like rope them in even further, but all the while with the intention of exploiting them. And so I know of women who got on, a bus to come to LA for her big break in the modeling career because this guy said he was someone who would help her break in. And it's awful. Some of them will do things like drug them and rape them and film it and use the footage as blackmail. Others will just, get them to be indebted to them. Like, oh, I paid for your photo shoot. I paid for your flight. You owe me now. You have to do this and this and this to pay me because now you're indebted to me. So there's all these different kind of tactics that exploiters use, and it's not as narrow as Hollywood portrays it to be. And I think one of the things that's hard and dangerous about that is that because young girls might think, oh, well, that's what a pimp looks like. They don't realize, like I didn't realize that I was actually being pimped and I was being exploited because I thought, well, a pimp has looks like this and dresses like that and behaves this way. And that was not the case.
Yeah. And even if I could even speak to just a few key points from what I read about your story, like what that kind of relationship looked like, he did not have a job. He would ask you to show him how much money you made, whether it was pre-strip club or during the strip club, and he would take it to do whatever he needed to do with. You also then, when he got someone else pregnant, pay for his apartment that was on top of the apartment that you already were paying for. He moved out with this other person. And you were still in this relationship. You were still connected with them. He's encouraging you to keep going and doing your job so that he can have his easy life.
Right. Totally. And the other thing is that he started using me to recruit other women out of the club who then also began giving him their money as well. And none of us really, I felt like I was stuck in an episode of Jerry Springer. I recognized that he was unfaithful, and I saw some of the, other things about it, but I didn't recognize that I was being exploited. And he was really good at it because he knew that he couldn't just say, give me all your money. Like, he could have done that probably, but it was much more effective to be like, how much money did you make tonight? Well, I actually need that. And I know that I really don't have a choice, that I have to hand it over because there's such an undercurrent of threat in the relationship. And that's the other thing. When you look at a trauma bond, the abuse, one of the characteristics of a trauma bond is that the abuse is sporadic in nature. Because if it was always abuse, most of us wouldn't stay. It's very similar to what you see in the cycle of violence when it comes to domestic violence, where there's abuse, but there's also these honeymoon periods and these periods where it's good and you stay because it's good. And then there's the tension building to explosion, right? So he wasn't constantly abusing me, but there was enough abuse for me to feel this constant sense of threat that I knew that I had to comply with what he was asking. And he didn't have to beat me. the threat was there. It was ever present in the relationship. So I've been through a lot of recovery, and I'm speaking from a place of, sometimes I look at that and that's a different person than who I am today. But when I look back at that person, what I see is someone who was so broken and so vulnerable and didn't know her value. And, you know, it's hard to look at someone and like look at myself and say, you gave this person all of your money. He was cheating on you. He got another girl pregnant. He got other women giving them, you know, their money as well. And you stayed. That's not wisdom, to put it lightly. And I don't want to judge myself. But at the same time, I graduated magna cum laude from UCLA. I have a master's degree from UCLA in social welfare. I was alumna of the year. Like, and I'm not saying any of these things to brag, but there's nothing wrong with my brain. Like, I've always been an intelligent person, but it just goes to show that when we don't have a sense of self-worth and identity, and when we are broken and vulnerable, and we allow other people to define and establish who we are, just the lengths of just brokenness that we can, you know, fall into.
You know, the one thing that I took away from the episode from filming with you last time was, this girl's on fire. Like, this girl is like, she's not one to be messed with. How could anyone have control over her? She, like, I wouldn't mess with you. But because it was a different person.
It was a different
person.
You know,
you were a different human.
I was a different human. And at that time in my life, most other people couldn't mess with me, except when it came to this person who I allowed to have complete control over my life. I look back and it's hard to believe that's the same person, but I think it also speaks to the power of healing and recovery. And, you know, if we are committed to a healing journey, and if we are committed to freedom and walking in freedom, there's no limit to the kind of restorative work that can take place and the kind of life change that can happen. I'm not an anomaly. Like, who I am today is a result of healthy community, unconditional love from safe people, relentless commitment to my own healing and recovery, relentless commitment, and God's redeeming hand. And that can happen for anyone, really. I really, truly believe that. I truly believe that for every woman who walks through these doors, that the kind of healing work that's taken place in my life is accessible to them, and that they have the capacity to not just survive the trauma from their past, but truly overcome it and go on to live healthy and flourishing lives. That's our vision. That's our mission. I've seen it happen. I know it's possible. I know it's happened for me, and it's happened for so many other women that I've had the honor of walking alongside.
That's incredible. And this is what you do now. Give everyone a little taste of what it is that you do.
Yeah. So Treasures, I founded Treasures in 2003, and we're an outreach and support group to women in the commercial sex industry and survivors of exploitation and trafficking. We do outreach to women in strip clubs, women in porn, women in escorting and prostitution, also in juvenile detention centers. We do work with youth. And then we provide mentoring, support groups, recovery resources, community, just whatever they need, the tools that they need to help them live healthy and flourishing lives. And then I'm also really passionate about training and equipping other people to replicate this model of outreach and care in their communities. And so we've been training people and have trained about 126 outreaches on 6 continents. We've been training for a long time, but I'm super excited because in January, we're releasing a digital training that's going to make our training more accessible to people around the globe and more affordable, so they don't have to fly out to LA and get a hotel and a flight and all of that. So we're going to be releasing that in January of 2021. I'm very, very excited about it. But that's what we do in a nutshell. And I love that I get to use the pain from my past just in this way, and to hopefully encourage and inspire others. And
it's amazing, but all this started, you're in 6 continents and you're about to go even further with this digital release. But it all started with you going back to the strip club that you worked at and telling the bouncer, hey, I've got notes for the girls. I used to work here. Can I just drop them off?
Yes. Yeah. 2003, I was sitting across from that club and I was thinking, what can I do to reach the women? And I just happened to have a stack of postcards that actually, it's right behind me. It's over this shoulder. It says on that postcard, her value is far above rubies and pearls. And that's the actual postcard. And I had that postcard and I wrote handwritten notes on the cards to give to the women. And I thought, what if I did this at more clubs? What if other people would want to join me? And, you know, I didn't even know what a 501c3 was at that time, but I just knew that I had to do something. And what I love about that story is just what's possible when we're willing to use what's in our hand. And in that moment, all I had was a stack of postcards, but I was willing to use what's in my hand. And the reason Treasures is where we are today, almost 2 decades later, is because we have an incredible team of volunteers. Mostly we are volunteer driven. We have a couple of staff, but mostly volunteers, of donors, of financial supporters, of contributors, of people who are just willing to use what's in their hand. And that's why we're where we are today.
Yeah. And it's incredible, but it's that first step. And I love how you said it. It's do what you can do with what's in your hands right now.
Right.
Don't wait for something else.
Right. Like no one can do everything. I can't do everything. We do a lot, but I can't do everything, but we can all do something. We can all do our part. And if all of us are doing our part, that's how we're going to be able to actually make a difference and make a dent in this.
Yeah. Can we start to talk a little bit about the adult industry? Let's talk about what life is like at a strip club back then for you now, but then also now for the women that you work with today. What really goes on behind the curtain? Because is that woman that confident, strutting, beautiful woman, is that how she views herself?
Well, I can't speak for everyone. You know, here are some things that I do want to share. One is that according to research, 70% of trafficking victims are trafficked into the commercial sex industry. That means they're working in strip clubs, porn sets, massage parlors, anywhere the commercial sex industry is operating. There's not a lot of research on strip clubs specifically. So we have a database of over 1,000 women that we've provided service to over the years. And we did a survey because we wanted to start to understand a little bit more about the lives of women in strip clubs. One of the questions on the survey was whether or not they identify as a survivor of trafficking. 1/3 of the women we surveyed said that worked in strip clubs identified as survivors of trafficking. And what that means is that they were lured into the commercial sex industry through forced fraud or coercion or prior to the age of 18. Now, for those, the other options were no, I'm not, or I'm not sure. And so we also gave them a place to share comments. For many of the people who said no, they were not a victim of trafficking, they said things in the comments such as, I'm not a victim of trafficking, but I began stripping at 15. By federal definition, that's a trafficking victim, but she didn't identify. She didn't recognize that about herself. Other people would say, I'm not a victim of trafficking, but I did have a pimp and he took my money, but he didn't beat me. Things like this that let you know she didn't identify as a trafficking victim, but she was. So let's just say on a low estimate, we're looking at 1/3 of the women we surveyed identified as survivors of trafficking, and that's a low number. Now, of course, not everyone who's in the commercial sex industry, not everyone in strip clubs has been trafficked. I'm not trying to even pretend to say that, right? But what we do know based on research is that 89% of women in the commercial sex industry want to leave, but don't see any other options for survival. And so does that mean that leaves an 11% that would say, I'm here by choice, I wouldn't want to leave, this is what I want. But that leaves a very large majority of people who are there because they don't see any other options. That begs the question, what is choice without options? Is that truly choice, right? But the tricky part is that those of us that are in the strip clubs, in the commercial sex industry, we're getting paid to perpetuate and sell the lie. If you were to walk into the strip club and say, do you like your job? And this happened quite often. You could see some men were actually trying to figure out, like, is this okay? Does she like this? Like, what's going on here? I didn't sit there and say, well, actually, since you've asked, I have a pimp that I'm going to give my money to tonight. I hate it here. I want to smash your face in with my stiletto because I'm so angry at men. But would you like another table dance? You're not going to do that, right? Instead, I would say, it's great. I can make my own hours. I make so much money and blah, 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 and smile, smile, smile. And I'm in college, right? We get paid to sell the lie because the truth, you're not going to make money if you try to say the truth, right? I told those lies so much I believe them myself, right? But the other thing about it, the other thing that I find super interesting about, the commercial sex industry, name me another job where you have to create a separate identity to do your job. So when you look at women in porn, many of them in porn, almost all of them in strip clubs, and almost all of women in prostitution create a separate identity. We go by a fake name. We create these aliases. We create these separate identities. I was Monique. That I remember the first night I walked into the club, the DJ said, "What's your name?" I said, "Harmony." He started to write it on the black and white board. What do you call it? The dry erase board behind him, and seeing it in black letters like that, it was too much. And I said, "Take it down. I'll be Monique." And from that moment, I began to craft this identity and this persona that was Monique. Harmony didn't have to show up to the club and do those things. It got to be Monique. It was a way of distancing myself from the reality of what I was doing, because the reality of what I was doing is too traumatic and painful. I can't think of another job on the planet where your work, you have to distance yourself from the reality of it in such a way that you create an entire alter ego. And one of the problems is I began to really lose sight of who Harmony was. So for me and for many, part of the recovery work has to be reestablishing the truth of our identity and figuring out the truth of who we really are outside of what the sex industry is telling us that we should be, or we're supposed to be, or our exploiter is telling us we should be. So there was a rabbit trail for you.
No, it was a lot, and you covered lots of questions I actually wanted to get into. But even if we just go back to what you're saying let's go low numbers. Low numbers, 1/3 of the women in strip clubs are trafficked there. They're there not by choice. They're there because someone has placed them there and told them they need to be there. Then you're saying 89% of women in strip clubs would like to get out. They'd like to do something else. So there's
Right.
11% that at this moment, at this time of this survey, we're saying they are very content being there. Now, if we were to take those numbers and we were to put that kind of stat to anything, if we were to say that, 89% of children, going to school feel unsafe, the government would do something about that. But in any sort of industry, Amazon, any billion-dollar corporation, any multi-million-dollar corporation would be put on blast if 89% of their workers wanted to leave.
Yeah. And so the study initially, this research is done by Melissa Farley, who's amazing. So the initial study was done on women in prostitution across 9 countries, and they found the number, the 89%. My personal experience is that number translates to other areas of the industry. Well, they actually ended up doing some research in strip clubs on both the rates of women who wanted to leave but didn't see other options, and rates of PTSD. And there was no difference in the rates of PTSD, which are equivalent to combat war veterans. And there was no difference in the rates of women who wanted out but didn't see any other options for survival in strip clubs. So just for background on where those numbers came from. And I agree. If you saw these kinds of numbers in any other industry, it would be cause for pause and some adjustment. Women in prostitution, research shows that 84% are under third-party control. So this is really important to pay attention to, because as we're looking now, we're beginning to see a movement to fully decriminalize prostitution in many states in the United States. That's really important to be aware of, because a large majority of women in prostitution are under third-party control. And decriminalization has been shown across the board to increase exploitation and trafficking in cities where decriminalization or legalization has taken place. And so, these are really important things to be looking at and to be aware of.
In the club, what do women think about men? The men that enter their club, and then the men that they dance for. What's their perspective of them?
I can't speak for every woman. But I can speak in majorities and minorities. In my from personal experience, my dislike for men grew tremendously during my time in the clubs. I was so angry at all men. I would go to work and I would wait and hope that someone would do something that would give me permission or justification to lash out and attack them, because I was so angry at men. It took a long time for me to heal from that. I'm in a very loving, amazing marriage with an incredible man who honors me, who I trust, who has earned my trust with his actions and his character. And I have seen firsthand him and a small handful of other men that I find very trustworthy. And I know that that is not what all men are, but it took a long time for me to undo what I believed about men during my time in the industry. And I would say my experience from working with treasurers for nearly 2 decades, and my experience with other women when I was working in the clubs, is that is not uncommon for women to really distrust, grow to loathe, hate men, become very incredibly fearful of men. And, you know, some of the women in our support group have PTSD to the extent that they are not comfortable being around men at all. Like, we have a person who does security for our support group. He is amazing. And there are times where we've had women call and say, there's a pimp, he's outside, he's found us, blah, blah, blah. And we're like, no, that's Albert. He's here for security. And years will go by and the woman will be like, I can't believe he's not here because he wants to sleep with us. It takes a long time for many of us to have to rebuild that faith and that trust that there are good men out there who are not only interested in who we are as sexual objects. And that's a very common thread. But we walk out on the strip club floor and put on that smile and act like we love it and act like they hung the moon, because that's what we get paid to do. But behind the scenes, it's a very different story.
Well, and I remember this was another thing that you told me off camera last time. You brought a woman into your office and you're like, tell me about yourself. And it's like, oh, I feel so empowered. I've got houses, I've got cars. And she's just talking about all the things that the adult industry has given her. And you asked her a question, you know, is this what you dreamed about doing growing up? And she went from this empowered, so pro adult industry to breaking down before you and just saying it's all a lie. It's all fabricated. None of this stuff matters. And just broke down before you. Is that so? That's something that I remember that you shared with me. I'm like, wow, that is the Monique Harmony difference right there. Does that happen a lot?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that I do remember the exact story that you're recalling. Definitely remember that story. It was a really incredible, powerful moment of just watching her kind of walls come down and just share the truth of her experience. But it's not uncommon. There are many times where we're met with that kind of narrative of like, I'm happy, I'm empowered, this is what I want. And when you meet a person in that place and don't try to convince them otherwise, and you're able to arrive for them with empathy and compassion, and not in a combative way, a lot of times you do have that same experience where the walls come down and you find the truth is different than what they initially presented in terms of what their perspective of the industry.
And obviously so, like, no industry wants to promote the bad things about their industry.
Right.
But there's so much that I think we as consumers, as males, the supply is because we demand it. Men demand it.
Right.
But if we only knew more about these women in the club, but we don't want to ask.
Right. And if you did ask, you probably wouldn't get an honest answer when you're in the club, you know? So that's the other piece of it.
What's the length of a career for someone working in a strip club? What's the exit plan?
Yeah. There is data on this. I wish I could remember the numbers, but one thing that I do recall from the research that was done is that the longer a person is working in strip clubs, the more the negative impact. So the negative impact of working in strip clubs increases over time. So you might have that first period, that 3 to 6 months, where it's like the person kind of feels like that false sense of empowerment. It's fine, blah, blah, blah. If that person manages to get in and get out, the negative impact tends to be less than for someone who ends up spending decades in strip clubs. And it really does range. Like, I know women who were in it for, a year, and I know women who were in it for 30 years. But one of the things that happens is you as you get older, certain clubs won't let you work there anymore. So then you have to go to the seedier clubs that tend to have more like things happening behind the scenes. And then in order to try to make the money you used to make as you get older, a lot of times women are put in a position where they have to do things that would violate their boundaries or things that they wouldn't otherwise want to do. But now they can't keep up with the 19-year-old who just auditioned.
You said something in your book, and this I think you said this actually in the interview too. But you're there dancing, and you say, I'm naked, but they don't see me. What do you mean by that?
Because really what the sex industry is very good at is stripping us of our humanity and reducing us to an object. And so when I was there in the club, I was only an object. I wasn't a person with an identity, with dreams and desires and a history, right? Like, that's one of the things that I think is so powerful about Story, is it humanizes the woman on the other end of the dollar. And when we see the humanity in her, we see her for who she is. It becomes more difficult to objectify her. It becomes more difficult to sexualize her or to judge her even, right? But in those scenarios in the strip club, I was an object. I was not seen for who I was as a person. And it's a very interesting experience to have that. I had that moment where it's like, I'm standing here naked and nobody sees me. Everyone's eyes are on me, but nobody actually sees me.
But what is that doing to men? What is it training men to do?
Well, it trains men to begin to see women in general as objects. It changes the way men view women. In fact, I believe there was a study that was done on this where as men watched porn, their likelihood of seeing women as objects increases. The other thing too is like it, especially like when you look at even porn, it starts to reinforce these false beliefs that all women are just like waiting around for this like pornographic sexual experience. And that like, even especially when you look at porn and the way, rape fantasies are acted out, or even when you look at the top 50 porn movies of all time, those top 50 movies have over 3,000 instances of violence against women. So what we're seeing in porn is the documentation of sexual violence against women, which then desensitizes viewers to sexual violence against women, to violence, and it pairs sexuality and violence, right? It desensitizes people to that. And then it starts to cause people to believe, well, that's what women like, right? So it really shapes and affects the way young men and women, because now 1/3 of visitors to porn websites are women, are viewing themselves, sexuality, viewing other humans. And that's especially dangerous when you're looking at the age of exposure continuing to decrease with access to porn increasing, and how that's affecting the way a young mind is beginning to conceptualize sex and sexuality and relationships with other humans. It's incredibly devastating.
What can men do? How can men be a part of the change?
Yeah. I mean, so we've been talking about a lot of really daunting and discouraging and hard things. And, I imagine that on the listening end of this can feel really maybe even discouraging and daunting. But I do want to encourage people that there is hope. There is absolutely hope. There's hope for the women and those in the industry to find healing and recovery. And there's hope for people who are caught and stuck in porn addiction to find healing and recovery. And I think one of the biggest things that men and people in general can do is to refuse to participate in the demand. Because as you said earlier, this, unfortunately, it is a supply and demand issue. If there were no demand, there would not be women exploited, people exploited, young girls, young boys, men, because this happens to men and boys too. I serve women, so I'm using mostly, I'm referring to females, and women are disproportionately affected. But as long as there is a demand, there will be a supply. So one of the biggest things that we can do is reduce demand. The way that we have to do that is one person at a time, making a commitment to not participate in the demand, to getting the help, the recovery, the resources that you need to not participate in the demand. And the other thing is, from the very beginning of Treasures, I always prayed. I remember watching in the strip club, men walking in with briefcases of money and spending all of it. And just thinking like, wow. And then being in the nonprofit world and here, these efforts to support survivors in their recovery and being like, where are the briefcases of money? But one of my prayers from the beginning has been that people who had previously participated in the demand would give restitutionally and redirect their money that they used to spend on porn, on strip clubs, on prostitution, to the recovery of those that have been impacted by the commercial sex industry. And there are a very large percentage of our donors who are people who are saying, you know what, I'm no longer giving my money into these things, and now I want to use a portion of it to support the recovery of women. And so that's another thing that people can do, is to give restitutionally.
That's incredible. That's such a good idea. And so the challenge is now for all the guys watching, for every porn that you've watched, donate $10. No, everyone's going to go bankrupt. No, but that's so true. Like if you've been a part of it, you can be a part of ending it. And I love that tangible idea of, helping a place like Treasures, helping anything in there. Because you've said you've helped outfit over 100 organizations like yours, right? To do the work.
Yeah.
So be a part, see if there's anything going on in your local area. And if there's not, what else can they do besides just not watching, by just not showing up and going to a strip club?
Continue to get educated and be a voice in your sphere of influence, because that's how ultimately culture is going to shift and change, is as mindsets change. Just never underestimate, like, people are watching you. I don't know who you are, but I know people are watching you. People, whether it be your children, whether it be people at your job, people are paying attention to the way you look at women, the way you treat women, the way you speak about women. And so being cognizant of that and choosing to be a man who honors and respects women is so important, because people are watching it. And then you are also leading by example for other people. And I really, truly believe that a big thing that people can do is be a voice and an influence in their sphere and the people they have an impact on.
So you're up against the giant adult industry that many people would be like, there's no point even fighting. Why do you fight?
Well, I don't see it that way. I don't think of it that way. I think that it would be hard to stay in that fight if I saw it that way. Instead, I see it as I'm really fighting for the freedom and recovery of the women that I'm called to serve. And for us too, it's like one of our values is the one, and no matter how quote unquote, big Treasures gets, or no matter how big the issue of exploitation and trafficking and sexual violence and abuse is, if we focus on the one person that's in our path that day, the one person whose life we can impact that day, it makes it much less daunting and more sustainable. And so I don't look at it as me against the sex industry. I'm for women, and I'm standing with the women that are in my path, that the one that I've been called to on any given day and any given moment, and supporting them.
Amazing. And that's such a great way of looking at it. It's even just how you started. It's like, well, I'm going to use what I have in my hands, and I'm going to give it to these women. And this might be something small, but I'm going to do it faithfully. And look what God has done.
Right. And when you think about it, it's like, what is the sex industry made up of? It's made up of people. And every person has inherent worth and dignity. every person, I believe, is being invited to a life of freedom and health. And so I can't look at myself as being against this industry, because it's an industry made up of people that I truly believe have, the capacity for healing and hope and change. So yeah, I just see it differently.
Yeah, that's awesome. How would you define your relationship with God as you started to get to know who God was from when you were still working inside the club to who he is today in your life?
The thing that just blows my mind, you got me, but is that God was always with me and always loved me, even when I was at my worst, even when I was the most stuck. Like, he doesn't love me any more today than he did then. And that's the mind-blowing thing. Like, it's not like he's like, now, Harmony, that you've done all this and blah, 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 now I love you. Like, he loved me then. And I remember having this experience very early in my recovery journey where God just like kind of, as it was during worship, during a recovery class that I was taking. And God showed me this picture of myself, 10 o'clock at night. And it was before I was in the sex industry. I was working in a coffee shop, and I would walk all the way from Santa Monica to Venice, where my exploiter who lived, to go give him all my money from working at the coffee shop, because it started before the strip clubs. And I would bring him cups of Mountain Dew with ice, and I had to rush, because if the buses weren't running and I had to walk and the ice melted by the time I got there, he would be mad. And so I was rushing with these cups of Mountain Dew. And I just felt like God was saying, I loved you then. I loved you then. I loved you then. Even when all I could think about was trying to make this abusive, exploitive relationship work. Even when I wasn't even thinking about God, God was thinking about me. His eyes were on me, and he loved me then. So whoever you are, wherever you are in your own journey, whether you are walking and healing and recovery, or whether you are stuck in a dark place in the throes of stuckness, God loves you right here, right now, right where you are. And he wants to meet you in that place wherever you are.
Amen. I love that. And that's the simplicity of of God. He just loves.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what is going on in your life right now. He just wants to love you.
Yep. Yep.
And if you let him, then you can embrace it.
Right. Yep. His goodness. His goodness.
I think, unfortunately, though, so many people think that they need to clean themselves up before they come to God, or no, God can't use me because I've been to strip clubs, because I've dabbled in porn for the last number of years. What good am I? How could God love me? And the truth is, he just does.
Yeah.
It's
amazing and profound, and it's his goodness that leads to life change. It's his goodness. It wasn't someone telling me I should, break up with a boyfriend or get off the pole or stop cussing or blah, blah. It was his goodness that led me to want to live a different life. It was his goodness. It was in experiencing his love and responding to his invitation of relationship and of intimacy and walking with him that life change happened. But the first step was allowing my heart to open to begin to receive his love and that invitation to relationship.
Yeah. And so your life has drastically changed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Have you seen this with other women that you've helped?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. We are built on valuing survivor leadership. And so the woman who runs our support group, we have two different groups. We have a Thursday empowerment group and a Monday night support group. The women who lead those groups are both survivors who both came to Treasures for support and healing, and now are in a position of leadership and health and recovery to where they're able to pour into and walk alongside other women. Same thing with women on our care team. And so Yes, I have seen this in the lives of so many. Is it an easy journey? No, it's not. It's not always easy, but it's worth it. And we are worth fighting for, and recovery and healing are worth fighting for.
Is there anything that you want to leave the viewers, the listeners with? Anything else you want to share that maybe we haven't covered?
I just want to reiterate the hope, because we've talked about a lot of the hard pieces and the pain. And, you know, one of the things about sexual addiction is it's driven by shame. And so maybe for some listening and hearing about the pain in the lives of the women in the industry, perhaps that's brought up feelings of shame. And that certainly wasn't my intention. It's my intention to shed light and to bring awareness and to speak the truth. But shame is counterproductive to recovery. Shame, you're not going to find recovery and healing in shame. So I just encourage you to move past those feelings of shame and to have hope and be encouraged that healing and recovery are possible. I have known men who've watched 7 hours of porn a day and were so deeply, deeply stuck in just the throes of addiction, and have gone on to walk in complete freedom, to have healthy marriages, to have healthy families. And so there is hope, there is hope, there is hope.
Thank you so much for your time today, Harmony.
My pleasure.
It's
great to be with you.
You're a beacon of light. You shine so bright. And again, I still can't believe that anyone ever had any control over you. And now it's so great to know that you've surrendered only to God, and God is just breathing so much goodness into your life. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank God for God.
Thank God for God. That's good. Yeah. And thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure to subscribe if you're not, and we'll catch you on the next one. If you have any comments or questions, leave them below. Subscribe on all the platforms you're listening. Like, share, and ring that bell for us. The This Is Me TV podcast is brought to you by Impactus. For more resources, This Is Me TV episodes, and how to give, head to impactus.org.